Right, we are live now. So, hello everyone. Good evening. For to everyone watching from wherever you are in the world. If you're watching from the US, then good morning. So from the UK, then good afternoon. And if you're watching from Australia, New Zealand, and Singapore and East Asia, then good. Thank you for watching the later in the night. So I am really privileged today to have Abir Mukherjee, who is a renowned crime fiction writer. Actually, he has won several awards writing about historical crime thrillers, which are based on Raj era Calcutta. And actually, the so on our Murder and Mayhem walking tour or virtual experience. Now we have a detective. We talk about a detective called Priyanath Mukherjee, who was a police officer, detective officer in the Victorian period in Calcutta. And many people have actually asked us if that has influenced Banerjee in the Wyndham and Banerjee series. So if it has or not, then that Abir is going to answer to directly. But I will hand over to Abir directly now without further ado for his talk today. So Abir, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Tathagata. It's wonderful to be here, and welcome to everybody around the world. I noticed that Tathagata, you forgot to mention India. You didn't say hello to anybody from India. I'm hoping there are people here from India, so welcome to everybody. And thank you for inviting me to speak. It's wonderful to be speaking to your audience, Tathagata. Now, I've been speaking at events a long time now, but I don't mind telling you this session makes me very nervous, partly because I'm imagining there's going to be people here who are probably quite familiar with Calcutta, but also because my talk is quite a personal affair. It's wrapped up with the factors that made me the person I am today, and also how a certain place and a certain time, which is India during the period of the Raj, shaped not just my life, but the lives of many of us. And it influences the modern world in many ways, even today. And it was the catalyst for my writing. So my talk is entitled Place, Time, and Committing Murder to Scratch an Itch: How Writing a Crime Novel Helped Me Make Sense of My Heritage. Now, let me see if I can get this to work. Tathagata, maybe you can tell me is it up on the screen now?
Yeah, it's there.
I'm just trying to, how do I control it? Do I just go into the presentation tab? So if I do that,
Yeah.
can you see the first slide?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think for this talk to be useful, I should tell you a little bit about my background. Contrary to my accent, this is a Scottish accent. Contrary to what you might think, I was born in London. But when I was about 4 years old, my father seems to have asked himself this question: what is the coldest, wettest place I can raise a family? And to that, there was only one answer. And I grew up in the west of Scotland in a little village called Bothwell outside of a town called Hamilton, which is in a place called Lanarkshire. A lot of people know Hamilton from its football team, but for those of us who grew up there, we will tell you that the town should be famous for something else, and that is its cattle. Hamilton cattle are all white and look something like this. So Hamilton cattle look like that. Indeed, so proud are people from Hamilton of our cattle that when they died, we had them stuffed. And for years, they took pride of place in a display case in the top floor of the town hall. Here you can see the stuffed cows being taken to the town hall for placement. I'm told that the cows aren't there, unfortunately, anymore. They have been moved, but nobody can tell me what's happened to these cows. But anyway, so we as a family, my mother, my father, both immigrants from India, from Calcutta, arrived in Hamilton with me in the late 70s. And at that time, the town was pretty much like its cattle, all white. And in the village of Bothwell, where we grew up, we were the local color. Now, you probably think you know where this is going. An Asian family suffering racist abuse from an unaccepting community. But while there was racism, no minority in Britain has ever escaped bigotry or abuse of some form in their lives. I have to be honest and say that the racism that I suffered was comparatively mild. And I would put that down to two factors. The first is that we were middle class, and middle class racism in Britain is far more genteel than the working class variety. And secondly, it's because the west of Scotland was and still is rather an odd place, where the color of your skin often matters less than the sect of Christianity that your family follows, where marrying a Hindu or a Muslim can raise less eyebrows than marrying a Protestant or a Catholic. Glasgow and its environments when I was growing up was basically like Belfast, but without Kalashnikovs, where your religious affiliation was all important. This may sound odd, but, in the playground, in the school playground, I was asked this question: are you a Catholic or a Protestant? And for a 5-year-old Hindu boy, that was quite a difficult question to answer. The question would come back, yes, I would say I'm a Hindu. And, they would say, yeah, but are you a Catholic Hindu or a Protestant Hindu? And those were the philosophical questions around which my childhood revolved. But there's a deeper point here, and it's one that centers on identity and difference and belonging. For me, the fundamental question wasn't whether I was a Catholic or a Protestant. It was whether I was British or Indian or Scottish or Bengali or somewhere in between. And I think that question of identity, of belonging and acceptance, it's something that all minorities, whether ethnic or sexual, LGBTQ, we can all identify with. The truth is that my childhood was actually quite wonderful. And a lot of that is down to the fact that the British, on the whole, are a remarkably tolerant and welcoming and inclusive people. To those that disagree, I would ask you to, point to me one other major country which gives its immigrants and their children more opportunities to become part of mainstream life than the UK. I can't think of one. Even today, you look at our politics. I may disagree with our government, but 2 of the 3 highest offices of state, the Home Secretary and the Chancellor, are British Asians, people of Indian origin or whose parents were of Indian origin who came to the UK. Now, I can't think of any other country where that would happen. But there is one proviso. The British are very tolerant as long as you're middle class. But we'll come on to that later. But also, my childhood was idyllic because of my parents, who came from Bengal in India. My mother, as with most Indian mothers, still refuses to believe that her son can be a fully functioning adult without her constant and rigorous supervision. I should point out that I am now in my late 40s and married. So she has passed on a lot of responsibility to my wife. But it's my father, who passed away a few years ago, who I think is more important to this story. Now, he wasn't a rich man. He came to Britain in 1964, arriving, as he would never tire of telling you, with £3 in my pocket. That's him right there. You can see him in the middle there. You can see he was a great hit at the 1966 Accounts Department Christmas party. But he was intelligent. He was an intelligent man. He educated himself and he loved Britain. He would tell you that he had a low tolerance for hypocrisy. But the truth was, to put it politely, my father was a professional contrarian. He generally espoused the point of view most likely to irritate whoever it was he was talking to. Either way, it meant he didn't have many friends, at least not male friends, as you can see. And in many ways, he reminds me of this character. Now, many of you outside of the UK may not know who this is, but in the UK, you might remember him. He's a character played by the actor Sanjeev Bhaskar in the series Goodness Gracious Me. And his name was Mr. Everything Comes from India. If you asked him, he would tell you that pretty much everything and everyone of note came from India. For example, Santa Claus, big beard, huge belly, terrible suit, Indian. Um, my father wouldn't have gone as far as to claim that, you know, Santa was Indian, though in our family, definitely the tooth fairy was Indian. I'll never forget the conflicting emotions the morning after my first tooth fell out, looking under my pillow and discovering that the tooth fairy had left me this one crisp 10 rupee note, which in Scotland was about as much use as an inflatable dartboard. Anyway, my father, he was hell-bent on educating his children. And like many fathers, his idea of an educational day out would be to take me and my sister to the British Museum. I wonder, your parents probably took you to museums when you were growing up as well. But my father, he took great pleasure in describing for me in some detail the different parts of the world and the different cultures from which the British had stolen it all. The Elgin marbles, stolen from Greece. Rosetta Stone, stolen from Egypt. And he had a special bile reserved for the misappropriation of items from India. Indeed, going to the British Museum with my father was like taking a trip to the cave in which Ali Baba and his 40 thieves stashed their loot. Now, you're possibly wondering what any of this has got to do with crime fiction, but I would ask you, please do bear with me. The fact is that from an early age, my father taught me that there were two sides to every story. It sounds like quite a facile point, but for a 7-year-old, it's a very important one. You know, I would go to school in Scotland and I would be taught something as fact. And then I would come home and my father would say to me, "That's not true." And it turned out that half the time the school was wrong and half the time he was wrong. The point is, from a very early age, I developed a healthy cynicism, a willingness to question whatever I was told. Now, I think this cynicism develops in all of us over time. But I think when you are the child of a minority, when you come from a minority background in a country, you realize at a much earlier stage that there is an alternative narrative, that what you are taught at school or by society is not necessarily gospel truth, but just one point of view. As I say, it's not just me. I think any child who grows up in a minority, as a minority in a culture that isn't their parents, develops this from a this natural cynicism from an early age. This realization that nothing is black and white and that what we are taught at school isn't the whole truth. Now, you could say that my need to write stemmed from this wish to tell the other side of the story, to tell you about the road less trodden, to question the perceived wisdom. Maybe it's my version of my father's contrarianism. And let me explain to you why I think that is an issue, especially in Britain. I think many countries, probably most countries in the world, have had to face up to their past. We have national myths. Every country has national myths, but very few of these national myths survive through time without challenge. Now, Britain is quite odd in that respect. Unlike its European neighbors, it hasn't been invaded or lost a war in 1,000 years. Not since 1066 has the British identity been threatened or, you know, essentially had to look at itself clearly in the face. What that's meant is that all of our national myths are still in place. And that is a problem. And I'll tell you why. I started writing my first novel at the age of 39. That novel was called A Rising Man. But the seed of that novel was planted 24 years earlier. And it finds its origins in anger at my English teacher, whom I have to say was a fantastic man. And it started in my A-level year of English, what we call higher English in Scotland. I should say that the Scottish education system is far superior to the English system, or at least it was in my day, but I digress. As I say, it goes back to my higher English class. You see, one of the papers in the English exam in my day involved having to write an essay. It could be a descriptive essay, a work of fiction, or an argumentative essay, which the final one, which would be in the form of a topic for discussion, such as, should euthanasia be legalized? Discuss. Wherever possible, I tended to go for these argumentative essays because there was a set formula to answering it. You just had to give 3 arguments for one side, 3 arguments against, and then you had to come to a decision, making sure that you professionally and politely undermined one side while writing it. The good thing about it was easy marks. It was a straight A. And I'm ashamed to say it did not involve too much imagination on my part. Now, in the month before the exams, we spent a lot of time doing practice essays. And one particular day, the topic for discussion was, well, I can't remember the exact topic, but it had something to do with what we could learn from history, or whether we could learn from history. And I think I jumped at the chance to answer it. It appealed to me. It appealed to the contrarian in me, the contrarian that had been brought up by my father. For the first time, here was a question that really appealed to me. I would point out that history is written by the winners, and you couldn't learn from history if you whitewashed it. I would point to the Bengal Famine of 1942 and 43. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with the Bengal Famine, I'm sure many of you are, but for those of you who aren't, in the middle of World War II, when a similar number of Jews were being exterminated in Europe, 3 million subjects of the empire, the British Empire, were allowed to starve to death with Churchill's connivance. The whole world is aware of the Holocaust. Indeed, there are laws in many countries making it illegal to deny the Holocaust. Yet, what of the 3 million Indians, subjects of the empire, who were effectively sentenced to death at the same time? At least when I was growing up, there was a resounding silence. Indeed, today, even 30 years later, very few people, less than a fraction of the population of Britain, know about the Bengal famine and about the deaths or by starvation of these millions of Indians. But I knew about it. I knew about it because my father told me about it, and that was important to me. I'd learned about it from an early age. How can I put it to you? This is when you grow up in a country and where you're taught to revere Winston Churchill at school, and then you come home and your father tells you or your mother tells you that Winston Churchill is complicit in the deaths of 3 million of their countrymen or their kinsmen or your own kinsmen. How do you reconcile those two facts in your head? Especially when nobody else, not your teachers, not your peers, is aware of these facts because it's never been taught in British schools. So basically, I would pour years of angst about the constant contradictions of growing up as a child of immigrants in a society that was always taught that it was on the right side of everything. That's the thing about Britain. I think even today, we always believe that we are on the side of the angels. And that's because we never question our history. In short, I was going to be clever. I was going to answer this question. I was going to point out everything that was wrong. Of course, I should have known that it never pays to be too clever, especially at school. I was expecting an A+ for this essay. I didn't get it. I got a C-, which for this child of Bengalis felt a bit like being mugged. To my teacher's credit, I must say he decided to discuss it with me. He decided to discuss it with another English teacher in the department, but they both agreed that my mark should be a C-. He gave me an explanation as to why they decided to give me this C-, which centered around the point that I could not say that dropping an atom bomb on defenseless Japanese civilians or causing millions of Indians to starve was as big a sin as gassing people in a concentration camp. And maybe you can't say that they are as big a sin, but to me, they were and are stops along the same road heading for the same destination. The fact is that Jews were gassed because the Nazis thought of them as less human. The fact is that Churchill allowed 3 million Indians to perish because he thought of them as less human than white British people. I learned a couple of important lessons that day. The first, as I've said, is that it doesn't pay to be too clever at school. Um, but more importantly, I learned that it was difficult to challenge people's accepted beliefs. Telling them something they don't want to hear, especially when it involves self-reflection, is extremely difficult. I see that myself, when the Brexit vote was on or after the Brexit vote, I had to switch off the news. I couldn't bear to listen to the commentary because it was not something I wanted to hear. Um, but this seed, going back to the point, this need to talk about the Bengal famine, planted in anger, the need to shout about it, has never left me, not even after a quarter of a century. At the same time, as I grew older and I visited India regularly, I became aware that Indians too tend to whitewash this period in our shared history. Just as the British, when we think of the Raj, we romanticize it. It's gin and tonics on the veranda, or summers in the hill stations of Simla, where the climate is like Surrey, or tea with the viceroy. Indians tend to romanticize the freedom struggle, preferring not to focus on the fact that British rule in India could not have functioned without the active participation of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Indians. Let's not forget that even Gandhi advocated Indian involvement in the Great War on the side of the British as part of its obligation, as part of India's obligations as a member of the empire. The accepted history of the Raj is very different in Britain to what it is in India. And I became fascinated with the subject of British India because neither the British version of history nor the Indian version of history chimed with what I knew, what I felt in my bones, sitting between both cultures. I didn't believe the Indian version because of a lot of it boils down to the premise that the British in India were some sort of amoral devils without conscience. In the same way that Europeans view the Mongols, heartless, cruel oppressors. And that didn't chime with what I knew about the British people. At the same time, the view, which is still prevalent in Britain, that the empire was somehow a force for good in the world, is, in my view, ridiculous. And it's a stance that needs to be challenged at every turn. I think we have, in our desire to airbrush our history, forgotten the true legacies of the period. We've thrown the baby out with the bathwater. And while there may have been a veritable ocean of bathwater, we should still remember that there was good. There was the baby. And I became to be fascinated by several questions. The first was, what was the relationship between the British and Indians really like? It evolved over time, especially after 1857, which the British call the Indian Mutiny, but which Indians call the First War of Independence. You see, already our history, the same history, has different viewpoints. The second question I wanted to ask, and I went to a Christian school where I learned the values of love and compassion laid out in the Gospels, and I wanted to understand, how does a moral Christian people justify to itself the oppression of another race? And third, and for me, one of the most fascinating questions was that of identity. Not just my identity, but yours too. If you're British or Indian or descended from either, what was it about these two peoples that in the 1920s and 30s, when the world was gripped by the evils of fascism and Stalinism, where any dissent was met by a bullet or a gulag or a gas chamber, in that international environment, what was it about these two peoples, the British and the Indians, that allowed them to play out the world's first non-violent freedom struggle? And I stress, it takes two sides to play that game. I can't imagine a non-violent struggle succeeding against the Nazis or Soviet communism in the period. Indeed, I was in Kiev a few years ago and somebody asked me, why didn't we see more people like Gandhi coming up? Why didn't we see more Gandhis in other parts of the world? Part of the answer is because they would have been shot in 2 minutes or gassed. And that's very important. What was it that allowed the British and the Indians, what was it in their nature that allowed them to play out this non-violent freedom struggle that had never occurred anywhere else in the world previously, at that specific time when the world was going mad? Let's be clear, that is unique. And I think that relationship still is unique. To this day, it's unique. there's a statue to Gandhi in the middle of Parliament Square. In the heart of British democracy, Parliament Square is a statue to the man who kicked the British out of India. That says something special about the British people as well as the Indian people. And if you doubt it's special, then you show me the statue of Ben Bella or Ho Chi Minh in Paris. These are the questions that fascinated me, and these are the questions that burned within me and which I wanted to bring attention to more people. The question for me was, how do I talk about these things? And the answer, obviously, was crime fiction. As I've said, the question of making sense of one's identity isn't a new thing. You know, many others have gone on a similar journey before. But for me, there was only one answer about how I was going to tell these stories, and that was writing the crime novel. So why? Why a crime novel? Why not the factual history on these topics? Well, there are several reasons. Firstly, crime fiction is what I love. I've read all types of literature, literary fiction, science fiction. I've even read some romantic fiction, though I'm not proud about it. But my home is the crime novel in all of its wonderful subgenres, be it American hard-boiled crime, Golden Age, English country house murders, Scandinavian noir, historical crime fiction. I love the idea of a good man upholding a corrupt system, such as Martin Cruz Smith's character Arkady Renko, who's a detective in communist Russia, or Robert Harris's Xavier Marsh, or Philip Kerr's Bernie Gunther, who are both in Nazi Germany. And then, of course, there is the crime novel as social commentary, which in my head, at least, I associate with the great Scottish crime writers, starting with William McIlvanney and encompassing Val McDermid, Ian Rankin, Denise Miner, just to name a few. Authors who know how to teach us something, to make a moral point, while at the same time telling a cracking story. I grew up in those traditions of Scottish crime fiction, of tartan noir, and it felt natural to me to use the crime novel as part of my own journey and my wish to explore a history which, like so much in my life, I didn't feel comfortable with. But there were other reasons for writing a crime novel. The first was reach. The fact is, far more people are likely to read a crime novel set during the Raj, at least in Britain, than will read a history book about it. And secondly, as I learned at school, telling people what they don't want to hear is difficult. So if I want to talk to people about the evils of empire, if I want to talk to people about the Bengal famine, especially British people, I need to sugar the pill. I need to wrap it in a cracking story. And if I may use two terribly mixed and cliched metaphors, to get someone to swallow their medicine, it's often best to sugar the pill. So let's talk about the novel. So I'm going to set out to write my novel, okay, to make sense of this period of empire in a way that I could accept, to examine its effects. But I wanted to look at not just the effects on Indians, but also the effects on the British. What was the effect of empire, not just on the governed, but on the governing? And I wanted to do that in a crime novel, all wrapped up with a healthy death toll. For me, the question was where to set my book. And fortunately, there was one obvious answer. It's a city that was founded by empire, an Indian city, which in many ways was the physical embodiment of British Empire, of the British Empire in India. And that city, Calcutta. It was the capital of British India for about 150 years. And while Delhi might have been the Mughal capital of India, and Bombay, at the time, a mere trading post, it was Calcutta that was the living, breathing heart of the Raj. Calcutta is a city, for those who don't know it, was founded by the British in the middle of a malaria-infested swamp in Bengal. It was there that the British and the Indians took those tentative first steps together, at first as relative equals, keen to learn from each other, but then, as time went on and British power grew, the relationship obviously became more unequal. But it was Calcutta through which the Enlightenment came to India, in large measure brought by Scots. They sparked what we now know as the Bengal Renaissance of the 18th and 19th centuries. And it's Calcutta, it's in Calcutta that serious organized resistance to British rule began, and where it continued right up to 1947. There was no doubt for me that Calcutta had to be the place for my novel. Of course, it helped that both of my parents happened to be from there, and I understood the language. And I had a particular insight into the peculiar culture of the place, including its British influences. And also, it helped that Calcutta, to me, is one of the most interesting places on the planet. Um, how do I explain Calcutta to you? If you do not know the city, it doesn't have the best of reputations. The history that's been written about Calcutta, we understand. We know about the black hole. We know about the poverty. We understand about Mother Teresa and her orphanage. But as always, there's another side to the story. This is a city that has a love affair with art and literature. It has more theatres than London and New York put together. It has more literary magazines than London and Paris put together. Bengali, the language of most of the city's inhabitants, was the first Asian language into which Shakespeare's works were translated. The works of Molière were translated into Bengali before they were translated into English. And of course, the first non-white winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature, Rabindranath Tagore, was a son of Calcutta. If you go to Calcutta Airport and you look up at the ceiling, you'll see that it's covered in writing. Those are the words of Tagore's work, Gitanjali, written in his own handwriting. It's the sort of place where a rickshawala is as likely to hum a tune that's 100 years old and written by a Nobel laureate as he is to hum the tunes from the latest Bollywood hits. And it's the only city in the world that I know where there was a riot because the book fair finished a day early. Calcutta is also a home of invention. It's where we discovered that malaria was transmitted by mosquitoes. It's also the home of physicist Satyendranath Bose, the man who gave his name to the boson. In the field of crime detection too, Calcutta has played its part, for it was here that the science of fingerprinting was codified. The work was done by two Indians, Hemchandra Bose and Azizul Haq, one a Hindu, the other a Muslim, but it's their boss, obviously, the Englishman Sir Edward Henry, who took the credit. Not only does place add authenticity to one's writing, the language, the culture, but in my case, it also helped to provide the answers that I was seeking to my own questions around identity and the curious relationship between Britain and India. Calcutta provided me with a human perspective on empire, the relationship between individual British people and individual Indians. And it's when you come to the personal level, when you come down to the level of individuals, that I think you get an aspect of this time, an aspect of the British time in India that you don't see from the history books. For example, there was a close friendship and exchange of ideas between Patrick Geddes, who was a Scottish polymath, and Rabindranath Tagore. They met in India while the First World War was raging, and they found common ground in shared ideas on education, in being in harmony with one's surroundings, interdisciplinary studies, sustainability of the environment, rural reconstruction, and peace. Tagore invited Geddes to provide the plans for his university at Shantiniketan, while Geddes invited Tagore to become president of the Indian College at Montpellier. And they stayed friends until Geddes' death in 1932. And what that showed me, and it wasn't an isolated case, many cases of individual Indians and individual British people becoming friends and working together. It gives the lie, or at least on one level, to this idea of a class apart. The British did have racist policies and they were separate, but on the individual level, you will see great friendships. And I wanted to look at that. Calcutta also showed me that my own cultural schizophrenia was something shared by the institutions. When I talk about cultural schizophrenia, I mean, am I British? Am I Indian? What am I? But I saw that in Calcutta, you have the same issues. I paid a trip to the police museum in Calcutta. And it was a very odd experience because there are many rooms which show you the history of the police force. And you start with the current day and you go back in time. So the first room was about the war on terror. And you have wonderful photos of heroic policemen standing, over terrorists and with arms caches that they've captured. You step back a room and it's the war on drugs. Again, heroic police, fighting drug dealers. And then you get to the period before independence. And suddenly the focus is no longer on the police, but on the freedom fighters. The police themselves in Calcutta are not sure how to view their predecessors. What happened in one day in 1947, prior to that, they were the instruments of the oppressor. The next day, they become the instruments of the people. How do you reconcile those two facts within an institution? That schizophrenia that I feel, I see mirrored in these institutions. But Calcutta helped me make sense of attitudes too. Calcutta helped me realize that the need for the British to see themselves as separate from the natives, to be different. I understood it through the prism of Calcutta. And yet it showed me that by no means all British were as high-handed and as haughty as I thought, and as most Indians still believe they were. So what have I learned? What have I learned in writing my novels set in Calcutta? Firstly, writing any novel, I think, is cathartic. And for me, it helped me come to terms with who I am. Who am I? I am Indian. Am I British? Am I Bengali? Am I Scottish? I'm a bit of all of these things. And writing the novel helped me see that. And it helped me to shout out what I knew in my bones, that perceived wisdom and the perceived history that is handed down to us about that time and place. Both the Indian view of history and the British view of history is flawed. My research into Calcutta of that time and that place revealed so much that we've forgotten, so much that we've just brushed under the carpet, such as the codification of fingerprints by a Hindu and a Muslim, a system that we still use today. Place helps one make sense of the differences between us. They say that to understand someone, you should walk a mile in their shoes. I say, go see where they live, spend time in their place, and you'll understand so much more about them. And if that is not enough, it's a very good reason. You writing a book, if that's not enough to help you write a book, it's a very good way of getting revenge on your English teacher who might have given you a C-. Thank you. Maybe we could take some questions now.
Yeah, thank you, Abir. We don't have any questions at this point, but if you have any questions, anyone, please feel free to write that down in the chat section. But we do have some comments. So cool. Namrata has several comments, but this is her first comment.
Hi Namrata.
And she's joining from Mumbai. And she says, very few people in India know about the Bengal famine. I wonder how many of the new generation know it in Bengal.
Well, that's fascinating to me. I'm surprised by that. I suppose I know it because, my father lived through it. He was a child at the time, but he remembers the skeletons, emaciated people walking in from the countryside and the villages and dying on the streets. It would hurt me that people in India today are not, it would hurt me that people in Bengal particular are not aware of this history, because it matters. How can we forget about it? How can we let people airbrush it from history? If we do not know our history, we will make the same mistakes. It's because British people aren't aware of this side of their history that I think we make mistakes around, issues even today, like Brexit. In my opinion, Brexit was a terrible act of self-harm by the British people, but it comes from an ignorance. It comes from a fact that we do not know about our own history. We believe the lies that we have been told about empire and about the strength of British character and the ability to stand alone, when none of that is true. And so it would upset me greatly if people in Bengal don't know about it. It upsets me greatly that people in Britain don't know about it. And part of my job is to educate people to that. I haven't written that book yet. And Tathagata, I know we've talked about this. I would love to write that book one day, but I do not feel ready to write it. And I need to take a readership with me. You know, those points are so difficult to deal with that I need to develop my readership to as large an extent as possible before I hit them with that really hard story.
Yeah, you have to build up to that. I mean, it was really difficult for me personally to research the Bengal famine experience that we have, virtual experience of the time. It's because it's just so sad that you I mean, even in my, I did my bachelor's in history from Calcutta, from Jadavpur University. Our course did not, maybe had a couple of lines on Bengal famine, and it's
And
in a
why was
bachelor's
that?
course. So
Why was that?
no idea. I mean, we did study the war, but it's mostly war in Europe. So it's very Eurocentric,
Well,
even
let's talk
today.
about that. Let's talk about that. Why? I mean, I know why. I mean, the history has been written by white men. I mean, and to an extent, brown men, and whatever men have written it, they tend to whitewash women out of the story. But I'll tell you, this is an issue that I have. History, not just history, but stories are seen from a very Eurocentric, US-centric point of view. Now, I was in Delhi. No, I was in Calcutta and Delhi, and I remember, going to schools and talking about writing to school children, private school children and public school children. And one of the issues was, I would set tasks such as, write me a story or write me the opening of a story. And more often than not, the characters that these children, these young children, 12, 13, 14 years of age, the characters in their stories would have white names. And it would be, a white setting. And that worries me. I can understand it here, but why, when I'm talking to Indian school children, okay, we're talking in an English medium, but why are the stories that they are writing, why are they about people who don't look like them? Why are we writing? Why are we so influenced by, let's call it Anglo-Saxon culture, that when I'm asking 13 and 14-year-old kids to write a story, the characters in those stories are white? Why are our kids still having to go through that?
Well, I think, I mean, I went to an English medium school here, and really most of the time what you read is white authors, Western authors. So our English medium syllabus had a different set of readings than the Bengali medium, which was also a part of the same school.
Mhm.
And while Bengali medium students were reading more Indian authors or Anglo-Indian authors, our English medium syllabus made us read more Shakespeare or more like
Mhm.
O. Henry and things like that. So we hardly read many Indian stories or
And
any.
is that changing? Because, in the West now, the syllabus in Britain is becoming less white. We're, I did have the chance to read, some work by Asian authors, but not much. But it's getting better now. But let's
Yeah,
take
it's
some more.
getting better here as well, which is a good thing.
Yeah,
Okay,
let's
so
take.
Ronita
Uh-huh.
Ronita has a question
Uh-huh.
about the famine. So she's asking, what is the British perspective on the Bengal famine now? Is there any regret
That's a
anywhere?
great question. I mean, the British perspective on the Bengal famine is non-existent. Now, I'll be honest. If you're talking about mainstream, okay, if you were to bump into the man in the street or the woman in the street, they won't know about the Bengal famine even now. Those who know about it, of course, there is a degree of regret. Um, but what does that mean? Of course, the idea of people dying is something that is regrettable whenever or wherever it occurs. Does it feel any different to say people dying in a famine in Ethiopia? I don't know. I don't think it means anything. There's a cognitive dissonance because, and this is the point I come back to. How do you reconcile The view of your history that has been taught to you down the generations with me telling you something which is completely different. How and it comes down to this man Churchill. How do you, which is known as, in popular votes, he's probably seen as the greatest Briton of all time, and yet he was a racist. His actions, either directly or indirectly, depending on your point of view, led to the deaths of so many Indians who were subjects of the empire. How do you reconcile that? And this is playing out now in the form of statues in the UK. So right now, for the first time, I think it's been pushed by the Black Lives Matter movement. For the first time, that in any great way, are British people questioning their history in general. So now we're seeing statues of slave owners pulled down. We're seeing statues of Churchill daubed with slogans of how he was a racist. So it's changing. People are getting a wider view than they've ever had before. And the internet and social media, all of that helps. There isn't only just one source of information anymore. You can get other sources of information. The problem is, if you don't know about something, how are you going to find out more about it? It's up to people like us to shout about it.
Yeah. About the statues, since you brought it up, I would like to know what your personal perspective is about pulling them down. Should we pull them down, or should we keep them there but create a context around it by creating an
Well,
exhibition or
I'm
something like
British.
that?
I don't believe in pulling down statues. I think if you pull down a statue, you forget the history, right? I'm much more in favor of explanation. That's the first thing to say. I would rather we have the statue and we point out that this man who contributed so much money to the city of Bristol, who built the Bristol Town Hall or this museum or that, opera house. Oh, by the way, he made his money, which is now your money, through slavery or through exploitation. Or if I look at Glasgow, this man who, built this library, or this man who's given so much to the city, he made his money through exploitation or opium. I'd much rather we have that than just pull stuff away. But I'm also British, so I think the way to do this is to do that, but also have a decision in, the local council over tea and biscuits, and come to a decision that if we're going to move the statue, let's move it somewhere else. What I would do is I would give everybody else their possessions back, empty the British Museum of all the stuff that's been stolen, and we can put the statues in there. Yeah, I think that's the way to deal with it.
Yeah, I mean, if you remove the statue, then you are basically airbrushing history, and also
Absolutely.
you are not acknowledging the fact that people are complex. They're not completely black or completely white.
Exactly. I think that's one of the things. Let's pick up on that, Pat. The former American president, Mr. Donald Trump, talked about shithole countries. Okay. And we know what he meant by that. But if you look at history, Scotland, Britain was a shithole country. The reason, I've been to the cemeteries in Park Street, and one of the things that strikes me, and this is something that Indians should realize as well, but also British people must realize, the number of people who left impoverished from Britain to go to, Africa, India, Australia, Canada, because they had no choice. You go to the cemeteries in Park Street, you see how young they were when they died. 15, 16, 17. They survived 2 weeks off the boat and died. Now, a lot of them didn't go to India because they had any choice. They were forced to go. And this is something that I think it's important to realize from both sides. The wealth transfer, the wealth that we see in Britain today, the wealth that we see in Europe today, so much of that wealth has its origins in places like India. And, my mother used to say this to me, it was all stolen, and I didn't believe her. But when you look at the statistics, when the British arrived in India, India accounted for approximately 20 to 25% of the world's GDP. When the British left, it was less than 2%. Now, there are factors like industrialization, the rise of America, but that stewardship, that economic mismanagement, that, effectively, stealing of resource, has contributed to the wealth of the West. So that really upsets me. And these points need to be made clear to people. We are rich today because you are rich today because your economic migrant forefathers went out and effectively harvested the world. Everything that you have today is built upon this legacy. So you shouldn't be one to judge. You cannot sit in judgment of other people for being economic migrants when your forefathers were the worst sort of economic migrant.
Yeah, that's a very very interesting and very important perspective to remember, actually. And also we need to remember, as you said, that colonialism would not have happened only by the presence of 12, 13,000 English, Scotsmen and Irishmen here. It
No,
is a
it's not
collaboration.
opinions. Well, I
And
mean, one of the things I learned from you was the is the role of Bengali Hindus in in the whole process. In terms of funding the Battle of Plassey, Clive's Battle of Plassey. Yeah, I assumed that it would have been funded by the East India Company, but I understand that it wasn't. It was funded by Hindu merchants in Calcutta, who then saw,
Murshidabad, yeah.
yeah, who saw Clive as the instrument of the goddess Durga. And so, it's all. And somebody has mentioned here the jute trade and tea. Madhu Nair is talking about Scottish businessmen, making up a huge contribution to tea and jute. And there's a couple of things I should say to that. I mean, the Tagore family, for a start, they had a joint venture with a British family, which I think was Scottish, called Carr. Now, you can probably tell me this. It was Carr
Yeah.
Tagore. And they did. They traded everything from jute through to opium. The opium that the British used to, in their war with the Chinese, was grown in Bengal. And Bengalis, the Tagore family being one of them, grew rich on that trade. In terms of the links between Scotland and Calcutta and Bengal, they are still there. They're not known enough in Scotland, but they are still here. You go to our universities, they teach Tagore, in Glasgow University. In the Mitchell Library, where there is, which is the biggest library in Glasgow, it's the biggest public reference library in Europe, there is a Tagore collection. The links between Glasgow and Calcutta, Bengal and Scotland, very deep. They're very similar people. Somebody once said that, Bengalis are like Scots without access to alcohol. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. They're very similar people. They both feel, superior to their bigger neighbors intellectually. The Scots feel superior to the English, and Bengalis feel superior to their Hindi-speaking neighbors, and neither can understand why they're not in a greater position of power. So there are many similarities, and the links between the two peoples are very, very deep. People like Michael Madhusudhan Dotto and Tagore are all of our, Bengali poets during the Renaissance. They learned from Scots poets like Rabbie Burns that it was all right to write in your mother tongue. In the face of this monolithic English culture, it was Scottish writers writing in Gaelic and in Scots that inspired Bengali writers to write in Bengali. And that to me is fascinating. Tagore was a huge fan of Burns. So many of the things that we think of as Tagore songs are actually Bengali versions of Burns's songs. And I have friends from India coming to Britain and coming to Scotland and realizing that hey, Tagore, so he stole it. There's this feeling that, but it's not. It was inspiration, and that to me is fascinating. And I wish more people remembered the links between Bengal and Scotland.
I mean, there are a lot of business houses which still
Mm,
function, not under
yeah.
Scottish ownership, of course, but they were originally founded by Scots. And
Yeah, well, I mean, you look at the
uh,
cemeteries. Look at the cemeteries. The English, the Welsh, and the Irish are all in one cemetery. Scots aren't going to be dead with them. Not going to be seen dead with them. We've got a separate
yeah,
cemetery.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So Shagnik has a comment and a
Uh-huh.
question, kind of, at the end. So he's saying, interestingly, at least as far as the West Bengal board syllabus was concerned, the Bengal famine was rather overrepresented in the Bengali literature syllabus, lots of Shukanta Bhattacharya, Subhash Mukherjee. While the history syllabus was relatively silent, I wonder what that tells us about the pedagogical dynamics here in
Well,
general.
I would say I can understand. It's good to see that it was reflected in the literary syllabus, and I think I can understand why. It was probably the one of the two greatest emotional tears in the fabric of Bengal. You know, we had that and partition; those two emotional tears, those two emotional fissures, you know, ran through a whole generation. If you are going to write, I mean, that sorrow, that pain comes through, and I can understand why it would be overrepresented in the literary side of things. You know, if you want to write about something, you don't write about happiness. Nobody's interested in happiness. What motivates us to learn is pain, is fear, is sorrow, and you know, an instance like the Bengal famine that scarred a generation has to be reflected in literature. In terms of the historical syllabus, I don't know. My gut says it's political. I think a newly independent country, not sure of itself. You know, I fundamentally believe that colonialism might have ended in 1947, but colonialism of the mind, I think, continued until the 90s. I think India only discovered its self-belief in the late 90s with the advent of economic power. I think the 40 years after independence was still a period of intellectual colonialism, where in the minds of a lot of people, in the Indians didn't think they were as good as other people. Now, maybe that's why the historical syllabus doesn't reflect it, because you have a young nation, because history is political. You know, if you want to prove your strength, you want to prove things, you don't dwell on a point where you were emasculated and helpless. It's not in the interests of the nation. I think it's only now India is strong enough, both you know, as a nation and emotionally, that now is the time where you have to reflect on these things. That's my personal view.
I mean, that kind of psychological uh, feeling is still there. I mean, you can see in political statements and all of that that Calcutta wants to be like London and things like that. So we still want to be like the colonizing country rather than
I,
have our own identity. So
yeah, this I don't understand. Let's talk about Calcutta, and let's talk about, you know, why do we need to ape other places? I don't understand that, and I think that is also linked to this idea of, you know, a lot of people say to me here they're very scared to say Calcutta anymore, right? Everybody feels they have to say white people feel they have to say Kolkata, right? My mother doesn't. My mother says Calcutta, and this is a point that I would make. You know, Calcutta was always Calcutta in English and Kolkata in Bengali, right? There's no difference there. It's just the difference in pronunciation. The fact that the city has changed its name in English, or the politicians have changed its name from Calcutta to Kolkata in English, to me is a sign of weakness. You know, the fact is the French call London Londres, right? In French. We don't say to the French, no, you must call it London. Okay, the Germans don't say, you don't call us Germany, you call us Deutschland. They don't say that. You call us whatever you want in your language. In our language, it's Deutschland. In Bengali, it was always Kolkata. In English, it was always Calcutta. I don't see the reason why we needed to make that change. Now, I can understand it in other cases, say Chennai. Maybe Chennai was Chennai before it was Madras. I don't know. But Kolkata was always Calcutta in English and Kolkata in Bengali. The idea that you're forcing people to change how they pronounce the name of the city, to me, stems from weakness and politics. You know,
and
and
also
that
lack of self-belief. I would
it
I
is.
would
It is.
say.
That's what it is. It doesn't matter what somebody else calls you. It's about who you are. You know, and again, I think this is about politics. I think it's about empire. But the fact is, it, as you say, it's a lack of self-belief. It's a lack of maturity. So yeah, and again, this is linked to the idea of aping other cities. Why should Kolkata be like London? In what way should Kolkata be like London? What does that mean? Does it mean, you know, an effigy of Big Ben like we have? What does that mean? Nothing. I don't see the point of that. Kolkata is Kolkata, and there's enough in our history, in our culture, for us to stand without aping other people.
Exactly.
No,
Okay, so there's one
sorry,
final
I'm getting
question.
quite angry. I'll drink some tea.
It's all right. It's all right. So Namrata is asking
Yeah.
that are all your books connected to Calcutta?
What, Namrata? You haven't read any of the book? I'm hurt. I'm hurt. Well, I'm hopefully that's going to change. There's always a connection to Kolkata, but not always. So the second book in the series is, although it starts in Kolkata, it moves to a princely state called Sambalpur. Book 4, half of that takes place in East London in 1905, and most of it takes place in Assam. And book 5, which comes out in November, The Shadows of Men, that starts in Kolkata, but a lot of it takes place in Bombay. And that's because I asked my my readership. I said, "Where should I send them?" And I gave them options, and they came back and said, "We want Wyndham and Banerjee to go to Bombay." So they go off to Bombay in book 5. And I hope you do. You promised here, Namrata. I say you promised you'll start reading the books. So I look forward to that.
Okay, so talking about like I'll end the session a little bit
Mhm.
because we are already over time, I think. But what is next up after like you are writing
Wow.
a book in the U on based on the United States?
Yeah, I've got lots of
Um,
things happening. Unfortunately, as usual, I'm Bengali and lazy, and I'm way behind. So I have my 5th book in the Wyndham and Banerjee series, which comes out in November. I'm currently writing a standalone, which is set mainly in America, but the UK and America, which is a current day novel, but it will feature a man of Bangladeshi origin and his daughter and American characters. So I'm writing that at the moment. After that will come another Wyndham and Banerjee book, which having gone on one of your online journeys across Kolkata recently, that gave me one of the ideas for that book, which is, India's first female photographer that you pointed out on that tour. And that gave me an idea for a novel. So that will probably be included in book 6, but I haven't started researching that yet. I'm also writing a true crime novella and that will be based on the Nitari killings, the Noida killings. So I have to do that. I have to hand that in January, and I haven't even started that yet. So basically, I have an awful lot of books to write, and I'm way behind.
well,
But
but
I hope
it's good to know that there's a lot of things coming up very like
it
fairly
is.
soon.
Well, yeah. In the next, I'll be busy. In the next few years, there should be quite a few books coming out, both in the Wyndham and Banerjee series, both loans and true crime, which I think is a big area that's growing now. You see all these true crime podcasts, and somebody said you should write a true crime novella. So I said, okay, I'll do that. So yeah, a lot, and
Well, that's
hopefully I'll
great.
get a chance to come to Kolkata and do some of these tours again.
Brilliant. Yeah. I mean, hope we can all travel soon.
Mm,
Yeah. So,
I'm
if
looking
there are
forward
no
to
other
that.
questions, I would really like to thank Abir for his time because he's
Uh,
really, really busy, as you could see.
my pleasure. My
Um,
pleasure.
and thank you for your time and thank you for this wonderful talk. Namrata is saying thank you very much as well
No, thank
over
you all.
here.
Thank you so much. Thank you all
Yeah.
for giving us your time this evening, wherever you may be in the world. Thank you.
And hope to see you again soon, maybe on one of the virtual or real tours.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Right. All right. Thank you. Bye,
Thank you.
everyone.